Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News Weekend. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced his new cabinet. There were a number of changes of interest to Indigenous people. APTN's Fraser Needham has more, beginning with an Inuit ceremony to kick off the proceedings.
Sally Webster lit a kulik, a traditional Inuit oil lamp, to bring light and warmth to the cabinet shuffle. Perhaps the biggest move, former Health Minister Patty Hajdu becomes the new Indigenous Services Minister. Best known for her many press conferences during the pandemic, Hajdu says it's a huge honor to be in her new role.
And to work with Indigenous communities from across this country. I think it's a critical role in our government's efforts to further reconciliation. And I'm just thrilled to be able to serve my country and Indigenous people in this way.
Former Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller slides over to Crown Indigenous Relations. One of his priorities will be around land.
The relationship has been broken because of land theft, and it's time to give land back, and that's just the reality of it. It's easily said, it's more difficultly done.
On Monday, NDP MP Charlie Angus asked for the removal of Carolyn Bennett as Crown Indigenous Minister, and it happened. And she now heads up a new department, Mental Health and Addictions, but she doesn't feel like she's been demoted and speaks fondly of her 6 years in Crown Indigenous Relations.
I am extraordinarily proud of what we've been able to do as a government on the journey of reconciliation. And from closing gaps to righting wrongs to being able to accelerate the path to self-determination, this has been an extraordinary journey.
Trudeau reiterated his commitment to reconciliation.
While we move forward on fighting climate change, we need to include reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in every job we take, in every step of the way.
However, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said it is time for Trudeau to put action to words.
Stop fighting Indigenous kids in court. Immediately make sure that every Indigenous community has clean drinking water. And truly, to walk the path of justice, we've got two really clear paths that have been laid out. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has the calls to action, and the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls has the calls to truth. Let's see those implemented.
Parliament resumes on November 22nd. I'm Fraser Needham for APTN National News, Ottawa.
The federal government has appealed a decision that could have potentially paid out billions to Indigenous children discriminated against in Canada's child welfare system. Cindy Blackstock has been fighting for compensation for almost 15 years. We spoke with her earlier. Cindy, good as always to see you. The Justice Department waited until the last minute but decided to appeal the compensation order. How disappointed are you?
I'm really disappointed. You know, I've always felt like this case is about ending discrimination against kids and trying to make some reparations for the victims that were hurt. And it's now been going on for like 15 years. So it's disturbing to see that the federal government is not yet fully able to kind of put down its sword of litigation against First Nations children. But on the positive side, I'm hoping that we now have from the public pressure a moment where the federal government will really focus on ending the racial discrimination that kids and families are continuing to experience, so that we don't have any more victims in the future, that we finally have a generation that's treated fairly.
I got to say, I can't think of a time there was this much public awareness around a decision. The government says they still want to negotiate a deal and give children and their families fair compensation. What does that tell you?
Well, for me, there is no negotiation below these federal court orders, and I'll tell you why. It's because the federal court order is recognizing that the victims were the children and the families that were denied the fairness and services. It's not my money. It's not anybody else's money. It belongs to them, and it's for the harms that they suffered. So we don't ever find ourselves in a position where we would consent to either reducing that amount under any circumstances or agreeing that some people should be out when they're now eligible. That's not our decision to make. We don't have authority to make that decision, and we will therefore be defending those orders in every forum.
Cindy, as you mentioned, been nearly 15 years. Just for myself, that's almost half my own life. How much longer do you think families are going to have to wait for a resolution to be compensated?
You know, the good news is it's right in the Prime Minister's hands. So there's a tribunal order that says that once the litigation stops, within 10 days, there will be a meeting where we press the start button on the process to distribute the funds. That doesn't mean 10 days after the decision the checks will roll out, but we'll hire the company that will then do that work. And that will provide some comfort and certainty to families when that happens. So we just need the litigation to stop.
At the end of the day, Cindy, how much do you think $40,000 will go, or any amount for that matter, to making up for what these children and their families have been going through?
It'll never be enough. I mean, I just look at the residential school survivors, the 60 Scoop survivors, the day school scholars, and you know, you can never recover your childhood, and you can never recover those sacred moments with your family. But for some of these young people who have been formerly in care, we've heard, you know, this'll help me find an apartment in a safe neighborhood, the first stable house I'd ever have in my life. Or I'll be able to reconnect with my community for the first time. Or I will be able to pay for my education or my trades program. And we've even heard from parents who have lost children who sadly were denied services under Jordan's principle. And some of those parents are thinking, well, we want to build a play park to honor our child, but so that other children have some of the help that my child never received. So these families and these children, they have plans to be able to make their own lives better and their other people's lives better. And that's why it's so important that the litigation stops and that the families and the victims finally get the compensation they deserve, plus other supports.
Now, Cindy, I understand that there is one order that the federal government won't be appealing. What can you tell us about that?
Right. So one of the orders that the government did appeal in federal court and lost was with regard to First Nations family or First Nations children off reserve who are recognized by their nations getting help under Jordan's principle. The government was challenging an order that made that so. Thankfully, the federal court ruled against them and said, no, you've got to make sure that First Nations children, all First Nations children, whether they have status or not, who are recognized by their nation are helped under Jordan's principle. So the federal court affirmed that, and the federal government has chosen not to appeal it, which means that First Nations children recognized by their nation, regardless of status off reserve, are now eligible for Jordan's principle this year and next year, and you don't have to worry about your services being cut.
Some good news indeed. Well, Cindy, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate it as always you taking some time for us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Take good care.
Iqaluit residents are still not allowed to drink their tap water due to fuel in the water supply. City officials say the likely source of the contamination, a quote, inaccessible below-ground void. 20 to 25 feet under the building seen here is a previously undiscovered fuel tank with a small space next to it. Officials say gas leaked from the tank, got in the space, and leached into the water tank. Iqaluit's Chief Administrative Officer explains.
It looks like perhaps there was some blasting done at one point, and there's a bedrock wall and a pretty small space between that bedrock wall and a tank. Like a concrete tank, the North Pier well. And an old fuel tank was located within that void, and it's suspended about 15 feet in the air in this underground void.
Water officials are expected to have test results early next week to give the territory's health department, which will decide whether or not to lift or extend the do not consume order. Last weekend, a fire broke out on a cargo ship just outside of Victoria, BC. An intense storm then caused the ship to list to one side, causing 40 shipping containers to fall into the Pacific Ocean. Here's APTN's Tina House with that story.
This video was captured 12 nautical miles away from where the MV Zim Kingston was seen spewing smoke as 10 shipping containers were in flames. It's still not clear how the fire was started, but the Canadian Coast Guard has confirmed that 2 of the containers were carrying 52,000 kilograms of a toxic material called potassium amexthantate. However, officials are saying there is no danger to human life at this time from the toxic smoke.
Air quality monitoring teams are ensuring that there are no readings that indicate hazardous air quality for communities.
Along with the fire, the cargo ship lost 40 containers into the ocean due to the ship listing to one side from a heavy storm. Some of the containers were seen floating nearby, but others have submerged underwater. Only 8 of those containers have been retrieved. And with Hurricane Category 3 winds hitting the west coast today, cleanup efforts have been hampered. Chief Harvey Underwood of the Sayout First Nation is concerned.
As Coast Salish people and as Sunchofan speaking people, our way of life is the ocean. And we clam dig, we crab, we fish, and we have places where we go for storytelling out in the Gulf Islands, and we just don't want our way of life taken away. And with these tankers multiplying year by year, you know, I believe they have to have some kind of a monitoring safety precautions.
Although the flames have now been put out, it continues to smolder. All mariners in the area are asked to stay 2 nautical miles away because of the shipping containers in the sea that could be combustible.
The containers are currently drifting approximately 12 nautical miles off the east shore of Vancouver Island in a north-northwest trajectory parallel with Vancouver Island. Based on this information, we do not anticipate them coming ashore, but that doesn't mean there's not the possibility of that happening.
Karen Riston from Living Oceans says despite assurances, she is still concerned about the sea life.
If those containers of toxic material have ruptured and that gets into the water column, it's extremely toxic to marine life. It will burn the gills of fish. It'll scald the throats of marine mammals trying to feed in the area. It could be really quite ugly.
Here in the Burrard Inlet, the tanker traffic will increase from 60 to 400 once the Trans Mountain Pipeline is built, and experts fear it's just a disaster waiting to happen. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Thanks, Tina. A Métis woman says she was mistreated by hospital staff in Winnipeg. That story and more coming up after the break. Welcome back to APTN National News Weekend. A Métis woman says she was mistreated at a Winnipeg hospital right in the heart of the Métis homeland last week because she's Indigenous. Michelle Karlenzig has more about how the woman's experience could have cost her life, and a warning to our viewers, some of these images are graphic.
Jacqueline Flett describes a trip to St. Boniface Hospital in Winnipeg as degrading and embarrassing. The 38-year-old has diabetes, and after a painful foot ulcer, she went to St. Boniface Emergency. She said after 2 hours of waiting, it seemed like the staff had forgotten about her.
I was basically like, what's going on? Like, am I going to be seen? And what's the holdup? And I basically said, is it because of my Indigenous heritage? And at that point, they kind of got like, not belligerent, but they got visibly upset.
Flett says she then brought up past racist incidents like that of Brian Sinclair's, who died in a Winnipeg hospital waiting room in 2008.
They said, don't you even go there. And I was just appalled and shocked the way they were treating me.
That's when Flett said she started writing down her experience on her phone, and security approached her and took her phone. She was told to leave, though there were no recordings of her time at the hospital on the phone.
They said that that I had to leave the premises and that I could go receive adequate care elsewhere. And they were told that the nurses were refusing me treatment.
She says she got her phone back and left. The next day she went to Seven Oaks Hospital, where they found the ulcer had caused a bone infection.
I was really sick and I didn't receive the adequate care at St. Boniface, and I was escorted off the property, and I was embarrassed and ashamed, and it was just really very insulting and degrading.
In an email statement, St. Boniface CEO said, "We are investigating this matter to ensure we understand exactly what happened and to identify any issues that need to be addressed." They also said, "The events as described are troubling and do not align with the values of St. Boniface Hospital." Flood is now recovering on antibiotics and doing well, but will not return to St. Boniface. Flood says she wants to share her story because she doesn't want this to happen to anyone else.
We really have to start working together and start speaking out. Like, I don't want anybody to be silenced, and I'm hoping that I'm a voice for all those that were silenced, like Brian Sinclair, that never had an opportunity to speak for themselves.
Michelle Karlenzig, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Heading west now to British Columbia, where the government is looking to reshape forest management there. The changes will focus on sustainability and shared decision-making with First Nations governments. APTN's Lee Wilson unpacks the plan.
In British Columbia, people protesting old-growth logging have been calling for change in forestry management. Earlier this fall, the Sycas First Nation in northern BC made a declaration calling for consent before logging in their lands continued. The BC government agrees and say they want a paradigm shift in their old-growth strategy. Nathan Cullen, the Minister of Land and Natural Resources, says the tools for managing forest were handed to forest companies decades ago.
Much of the direction and authority had been given away to licensees, to large forestry companies. And over the last 20 years, we've really seen the results, that we've lost about 30,000 jobs. We've lost dozens and dozens of mills. We see more and more investment in forestry from BC companies, but not here in BC.
Last week, BC introduced Bill 23, which would make changes to Forest and Range Practices Act that would revamp forest management in the province. It would shift decision-making power from industry back to communities and First Nations. Minister Cullen says if this bill passes, the tools for old-growth management and deferrals can be put in place.
What we're doing is we're working with Indigenous governments around BC, because that was the first recommendation, if you'll remember, from the old growth panel, was to make sure that we were engaging respectfully with the rights and title holders, not just running around with a map and a marker and saying, this is what's not going to be logged, this is what's going to be logged. Those are days past.
The Estella First Nation, located near Quesnel, sees the bill as a positive change. According to the nation's chief, Troy Baptiste, the previous policy and stewardship plan left little to no room for Indigenous input.
We had nothing to do with it before, so this is all new to us, and it's a learning process we're going through.
Chief Baptiste thinks improvements to the Forestry Act are a step in the right direction. The nation's been recently included in the landscape planning process for the province. He says traditional knowledge and modern forestry practices can come together for a healthy land for future generations.
First Nations, as well as other stakeholders, have valuable input on what interests they would like represented and how that process will look. This allows for forest landscape management that will improve the overall health and resiliency of the forest ecosystems and help to reduce the risk to biodiversity.
Minister Cullen believes conflicts seen in the last 10 to 20 years in BC could have been prevented by having Indigenous communities be partners.
Bringing people into the process very early on, respecting rights and title of First Nations and our obligations there, will make for much better plans over the entire territory and landscape. That's what we're doing as a government. That's just our values being expressed, and that's what we ran on the last election. So that's why you're seeing these things come up.
The bill is now in the legislation process, and Cullen estimates they are weeks away from getting it passed. Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Kitimat.
Time for another quick break, but stick around. There's more to come. Welcome back to the Yukon now, where advocacy organizations say there needs to be more affordable housing so vulnerable people don't fall through the cracks. Sarah Connors has the details.
It's a hard life not having a home. Home is where the heart is, and I don't have I feel like sometimes I don't know what to say.
Phyllis, who didn't want to share her last name, is from Cambridge Bay, Nunavut. She's been homeless for 3 years. While income support pays for her to stay in a hotel, it's not the life she pictured for herself.
A lot of friends don't know that I go through this because I'm ashamed sometimes.
Phyllis would like to prepare her own meals, but there's no kitchen space in her modest hotel room, not even a microwave.
I've had to eat out of a can, cold things.
Phyllis wants a place of her own in Whitehorse, but with the average apartment costing around $1,400 a month, she can't afford it as someone on income support.
They just don't look at you anymore. They're just like, oh, okay, well, we'll call you back, and they never do.
Housing here in Whitehorse is hard to come by. According to the Yukon Anti-Poverty Coalition, in the last 10 years, the population has increased by a quarter, but the availability of housing has not. The rental vacancy rate in April 2021 was only 1.7%, and prices are going up.
Kate Meechan is the executive director of Safe at Home, which aims to improve housing for low-income and vulnerable Yukoners. She says homelessness is a growing issue.
100% across the board. There's not a single person that doesn't call us who doesn't have an affordability issue.
In August, Safe at Home released a report which found that on April 13th and 14th of this year, at least 151 people in Whitehorse were homeless. 52% of respondents were homeless for the entire past 12 months. It also found 85% of respondents were Indigenous.
So that's a pretty overwhelming number, and it's actually up from 2018. So we're not moving the needle on First Nations experiences of homelessness here. Hotels right now, for example.
Meechan says it could actually be fairly simple to solve homelessness if there were more supports and unique partnerships available, and if decision makers were more willing to assert more measures to get housing built.
And yeah, there'll be a front-end cost to all of that, but you know, it will pay off in the long term in terms of alleviating pressure on other systems.
Some strides are being made. The federal government is investing millions of dollars in housing in the Yukon, and Whitehorse City Council recently voted in support of converting this hotel into 55 units of supportive housing. Phyllis says she hopes to be approved for housing there someday, but for now, this is her reality.
Whitehorse is a really good place to live. There's so many kind people all over, but yet it's so hard to find a home.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
That is all the time we have for your APTN National News for this weekend. For news anytime, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
To live wild and run free, and they helped the people. The people needed them. They didn't need the people.